How's everybody doing? Right. So in our last episode, we talked about human formation and kind of what that means, meaning the development of the natural virtues of prudence, temperance, justice, and fortitude, right? This time, I want to discuss a little more in depth, kind of the second part to this whole topic, and that is how that spirit or that human formation leads into our spiritual formation, our relationship with God. And last time I kind of mentioned it a little between, looking at each of the virtues and maybe how they could help, each of the natural virtues and how they could help one deepen their relationship with God. But this time I want to go a little bit more in depth on that. So first, let's look at what's usually considered the first virtue to be cultivated at all, and that would be the virtue of prudence, which is really the virtue that allows the person to use their rational faculty, so their mind thinking rightly. It's the virtue that allows the person to think rightly, to think rightly in order to make the most correct decision in a given situation. So prudence is really the ability to, in the mind, come up with, okay, what is the best course of action to take in this situation? Okay, I think that's a really easy way to look at the virtue of prudence. Now, and I would say the next virtue to really look at would be temperance. I think that it's probably the second virtue that needs cultivated, and it's not like these are it necessarily has to happen in this way. I think most people would say prudence is primarily necessary, because without it, if you can't think rightly, then generally you're not going to be able to act rightly, right? And the other three virtues have to do more with acting than they do with thinking, okay? Prudence is the one that helps us think correctly, whereas the other virtues help us act correctly, okay? And before I get off course, in relation with a prudence, how does it help the person flow into their relationship with God? How does it help the person become more receptive to God's grace? And here's what I would say to that question. Prudence, by allowing us to think more clearly, to think rightly, in order to make the correct decisions. When we think rightly, when we think clearly, when we rationalize, right, we are much more able to see God's working in our life. And not just in our life, but in the lives of other people and in the world around us in general. It may not have to deal with other rational beings, other humans, but it may deal with seeing God's goodness in all of nature around us, whether it be, the soil that we walk upon, the plants that we walk by, the animals that we come into contact with. Prudence can help us in all of those situations to think rightly and therefore make the best decision for action. Okay? And because of that, again, I think we're able to see God's working in our life in not only direct ways, which I would say generally, if God's working in your life in a very direct way, you're going to know he's doing it. Okay? Otherwise it would be indirect. Okay? It will be utterly clear to you that God is working in your life if he's working in your life in a direct way. But prudence, this virtue, can help us see God's action in our life in the indirect ways. So if the Lord is trying to speak to me through another person, let's say, through a coworker, and that coworker says, "Hey, you numbskull, Parker, you better get your act together. You're being pretty lazy at work." Well, someone who's cultivated the virtue of prudence will, internalize that accusation, let's say, whether it's right or wrong. They will listen to that accusation and be able to think to themselves something like this, maybe say, well, in what ways have I been lazy at work? Okay? In what ways have I been lazy at work? Because I'm most likely not perfect in my work. So there probably is a grain of truth there. But I also don't want to be a doormat, right? And so, as to not be utterly submissive to the other person's accusation? In what ways can I make sure that I uphold my own personal human dignity in my own eyes, and make sure that my own human dignity is known to this other person or multiple people, right? So that there can be a mutual respect there in proper order, right? There can be a mutual respect at work between peers, and there can also be a mutual respect between subordinates and superiors, right? It's a different kind of mutual respect, generally speaking, but there needs to be mutual respect there in order for the relationship to work correctly, right? So that's an example kind of how prudence maybe in my life could help me think rightly about a situation, and then therefore, because I have now thought rightly on how to internalize and how to act upon that information that I've been given, that accusation of laziness that's been made to me and or about me, right? So I think that's a decent example of how the virtue of prudence can work in our lives. But then in that situation, how does it allow me to be more receptive to the grace of God in my life? Well, if I am being accused of laziness, or what many people might say intemperance, so lacking the virtue of temperance is generally a lazy thing, and it may also be a lack of justice, because I'm not fully giving my employer what is his due via the contract of my work, right? Or it may be a lack of fortitude on my part. Maybe I am so scared of maybe someone that I'm working with, let's say, that it petrifies me so that I do not work, and therefore, the appearance of laziness or the fact of laziness is made manifest in my life. Okay? So you can see how all these virtues, these human virtues, they're very related. They're very related. And in relation to God, in relation to, let's say, those theological virtues of faith, hope, and love, it may not seem that there's anything readily applicable about that situation. But let's look at this a little more deeply. In the situation of my being accused of laziness, the first one that comes to mind would be a lack of love, of charity, of the virtue of charity, right? For both myself and my neighbor. Principally, that would be on the surface, because of those lacks of justice and temperance and fortitude that have been there. It's not being loving or charitable towards myself, especially if I'm, let's say, lacking the virtue of fortitude, right? And I'm petrified of another person. That means that I'm not seeing my true dignity, and I'm not able to exude that to another person, right? It's kind of an unnecessary fear that, like I said, can petrify, can freeze us in place, make us immobile, and therefore seem lazy. Okay? So that laziness is additionally a lack of the virtue of love towards both myself and my neighbor. And subsequently, since the love of neighbor is also the love of God in a very real way, as Jesus tells us in the Gospels, it is therefore a lack of love or charity towards God himself. Okay. But there's another way in which it is a lack of love towards God himself, and that would be this laziness is a lack of love of what the command that God has given humanity. And man, males in particular, his command to Adam is to till the earth and cultivate it, right? To till the earth and cultivate it. So to work, to create physical fruits for not only himself, but for his wife, and, therefore, for his family and the societal family that would later spring up, right? So it's also guarding the goodness of work, of labor that God has created, God has set in order, okay? And I think a proper discussion of exactly what work is in the Catholic mind is for a different episode. Now, I believe I did 1 or 2 episodes at the very beginning of my podcast journey that you might want to check out. But I do think there's still a lot more that I could say on that issue, and there have been. I've learned some things since then, and so maybe that's an episode I can make soon. Is revisiting the question of what is the dignity of labor, what is the dignity of work. Okay, but all right. So that's one connection then to the theological virtues, right? If we're looking at things not just from a purely natural perspective, but a theological perspective, that's how that situation of my being accused of laziness may fit in the theological virtues, namely by the virtue of love. So, all right, I think that wraps up prudence fairly well, and we also mentioned all the other 3 virtues in those examples as well. But I want to go on to the second virtue of temperance now and see how it's potentially and actually related to the theological virtue. So the virtue of temperance, as we discussed last time, is the virtue which allows proper regulation in my life of what I consume, and also in what way I expel energy and other whatever might otherwise come out of my body. In what way do I expend those things? That would be the virtue of temperance. What I take into my body, and also what I exude, I guess you could say. I feel like I'm missing the right word there, but I think you understand what I mean. From my body. Okay. Because most people, when they think about temperance, they think about food, generally. Food and drink, and not overdoing it. And the beauty about the virtue of temperance is that our bodies have warning signals in them that tell us when we've gone too far, when we've crossed into the vice of intemperance or gluttony. Okay? If I eat a giant cake, I am going to have a terrible stomachache and probably get sick and expel that cake that I ate from my body, right? That's my body telling me, hey buddy, you were pretty intemperate, you were pretty gluttonous, you overdid it. And additionally, not only overeating, but undereating, severely hindering one's health by undereating. You can think of something like the disorder of anorexia or bulimia, right? Those would be on the opposite side, intemperance, and I guess maybe you wouldn't call it gluttony, right? But I'm honestly not sure what you would call it. Yeah, besides just starvation of oneself in a unnecessary way, right? Because there can be a just kind of starvation, you could say, and we call that fasting, right? Where I do not eat as much food in order for the greater glory of God, right? And not only is it directed towards God, but St. Thomas Aquinas, and I'm sure many other theologians and doctors of the church would agree with this, but I know St. Thomas Aquinas says it, is that he considers fasting actually a natural virtue. He considers it part of the natural law that we need to fast. And I think we're seeing in our day a lot of people beginning to understand that. You see, or at least I see ads all the time for like intermittent fasting. Okay. I don't think 10 or 15 years ago that was a very popular ad to run. Okay. Maybe exercising was, but not just fasting. So, it's not only something that we do for the greater glory of God and the salvation of souls, but it is also something that we do just on a natural level to keep ourselves healthy so that we may glorify God in our bodies, as St. Paul says. Or at least I think that was St. Paul. One of the epistles, the writer writes that. So, okay, so I think that kind of goes over temperance a little bit, Well, I guess I should say also, not only in fasting and the regulations against gluttony or the opposite regulations against undue starvation, right? Extreme, you could say almost like a vicious form of fasting, right? There's also an elegance and a beauty, and I think one could even say that there is a virtue of feasting properly. I mean, it's probably connected to the virtue of leisure. Okay. Leisure being where we truly revel in the good things that God has given us, and we use it for our own legitimate edification and rest. Okay, I think that's a decent definition of leisure. Okay, but the virtue of feasting would be that virtue of leisure in application to food and drink. Okay, truly reveling in the things that God has made, particularly as regards food and drink, and consuming it in such a way that it satisfies our bodies to contentment, right? But without going overboard to the point of nausea and the like. Okay. And I think this is really elucidated out, particularly in the use of alcohol. Now, of course, there are some people who struggle with alcoholism, right? Either genetically or because of habits that they've accrued throughout their life. And those people, it is generally said, I think, that they should not engage in the drinking of alcohol. Okay. But those who have not had such habit build up, such an addiction, right, there does need to be a cultivation of how to drink alcohol correctly. And that, of course, includes that necessitates not becoming drunk, okay, which is where we get to the point of losing our rational faculties of intellect and will. And if you throw in Bonaventure's third faculty of the will, or of the soul, it would be the memory. Not memory like psychological memory, but memory of the imprint of God upon us. So, drunkenness, if it prevents us from using our will correctly and rationally thinking correctly, and then also we get to the point, where we black out, especially then, at that point we have kind of stamped the memory of God out upon our soul, or that sounds really harsh. What I mean is we have basically forgotten the memory of God that is upon us, the footprint of God that is upon us at that point, and we have kind of drunken ourselves into oblivion, basically, if the person is drinking themselves until they pass out, right? That's not only drunkenness, that's like a whole other level of drunkenness, okay? That's like the farthest extreme almost that you can go besides drinking yourself to death, okay? But there is a legitimate idea of drinking to the point of levity. And this is taking, I know particularly from Aquinas. He kind of explains it in this way, to where alcohol can help a person kind of relax. Yeah, I would say relax to the point to where some of their walls might fall down in a beautiful kind of way. The defenses that we put up, they might fall down, and the person will become very, very joyful, and it can help even conversation, and it can help thinking. Actually, it can almost enhance, to a certain extent, the faculties of our soul, of intellect, will, and even our memory. It can make us revel in that imprint of God that is upon us, that God has put upon us, that memory of God that is upon our souls. And that's a very beautiful version of levity, I think, or I should say a beautiful description of levity. And that is I would say an example of the virtue of feasting, if I may call it that, the virtue of feasting. So, okay, so we have covered prudence and we have covered temperance. And I just made it home, so I'm going to have to stop it here. But next time, I want to continue, and we can discuss the virtues of fortitude and justice, except we'll probably do justice and then fortitude. I think it flows a little better that way. We'll talk about justice, and then we'll talk about fortitude, and how we'll give some more examples, and we'll give how they relate to the theological virtues and our relationship with God, our spiritual life. All right. Thanks, everybody. And yeah, find me on www. Wow. Okay, start over. Let's just say Catholicisminthecar.com. Let's throw out the www dot part, www, whatever it is. Catholicisminthecar.com. You can see everything of mine there. I am starting a newsletter. So if you want any updates on videos or podcasts that I put out, even I might even do, if I ever get to the point of putting articles out, you can subscribe to the newsletter and you will get all those podcasts, videos, and then potentially articles in your inbox, okay, your email. And there's a link on my website And I've also put it on a lot of my social media pages. So you can find that there if you are interested in getting this content directly to your inbox. All right. So God bless y'all. See you later.